This is a true story of a telephone call that never should have been possible. In the middle of World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt sat in a guarded room in the Pentagon and spoke directly to Prime Minister Winston Churchill in London, across 3,000 miles of ocean, through cables the enemy could tap at any moment, and the Germans heard nothing but noise. What made this possible wasn't magic. It was a machine so large it filled an entire room, so complex it required a team of engineers to operate, and so secret that even most government officials didn't know it existed. It was called SIGSALY, and it was the world's first secure digital voice communication system, built decades before the word digital meant anything to most people. What you're about to hear is the story of how two nations built an invisible shield around the most important conversations of the war, and how a room full of whirring machines became the ancestor of every encrypted phone call made today. The problem? Every word could be heard before. SIGSALY, secure long-distance communication between Allied leaders, was nearly impossible. Roosevelt and Churchill couldn't simply pick up a phone and talk. Every transatlantic telephone line ran through undersea cables or radio circuits that could be intercepted. And the Germans were listening. German signals intelligence units had proven themselves devastatingly effective. They monitored radio traffic, tapped telegraph lines, and recorded telephone conversations. When Allied leaders tried to use scrambler phones, primitive devices that distorted voices by inverting audio frequencies, German engineers quickly figured out how to unscramble them. Within weeks of the scrambler's introduction, transcripts of secure calls were landing on desks in Berlin. Imagine being Roosevelt in 1942. The war is at its most desperate. North Africa is contested. The Soviets are bleeding. Plans for the invasion of Europe are still fragile and secret. You need to coordinate with Churchill, daily, sometimes hourly, but you know the enemy is listening to every word. So you rely on couriers, coded telegrams, and carefully worded messages that take hours or days to cross the Atlantic. And in war, hours can mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. One American intelligence officer later wrote, "We knew the Germans were ahead of us in signal security. We knew they could break our scramblers. And we knew that if they intercepted the wrong conversation at the wrong time, they could shift the entire course of the war." Something had to change. And in a laboratory in New Jersey, a team of engineers at Bell Telephone Laboratories was about to invent the future. The birth of SIGSALY, a machine ahead of its time. In 1942, Bell Labs began work on a project so ambitious it seemed impossible, a voice encryption system the Germans couldn't break. The team was led by engineers who understood that the old scramblers failed because they were analog. They twisted sound, but the twist could be untwisted. To build something truly secure, they needed to do something no one had ever done before: turn human speech into something that wasn't speech at all. The solution they developed was SIGSALY, officially known as the Gex system. And it was revolutionary. Here's how it worked. In the simplest terms, SIGSALY didn't scramble voices. It destroyed them, then rebuilt them on the other end. When Roosevelt spoke into the SIGSALY microphone, the system broke his voice down into its component frequencies, 10 separate audio channels, each carrying a slice of the sound spectrum. Then it sampled those frequencies 50 times per second, converting the continuous sound waves into discrete pulses, essentially turning analog speech into a digital-like signal, decades before digital technology became standard. But that was just the beginning. To encrypt those pulses, SIGSALY added noise, massive amounts of random noise, generated by a synchronized pair of phonograph records. One record played in the Pentagon, an identical copy played in the receiving station in London. The noise on both records was exactly the same, down to the millisecond. The system added this noise to Roosevelt's voice signal, completely drowning it out. What was transmitted across the Atlantic cable was pure chaos, static and hiss, impossible to decode. On the receiving end, Churchill's SIGSALY machine played the exact same noise record in perfect synchronization. It subtracted the noise from the incoming signal, and, like magic, Roosevelt's voice emerged, clear and intelligible. If you intercepted the transmission without the matching noise record, all you heard was gibberish. The Germans tried. They recorded SIGSALY calls. They analyzed them with the best cryptanalysts in Europe, and they got nothing. One Bell Labs engineer later described it this way: imagine two people standing in a hurricane shouting at each other. You can't hear them because the wind is too loud. But if you know exactly how loud the wind is and exactly when each gust blows, you can subtract the wind from the sound and recover the voices. That's what SIGSALY did, except the hurricane was mathematical and the wind was on a phonograph record. A machine the size of a room, SIGSALY wasn't a phone, it was a facility. The system required 40 racks of equipment, weighed over 50 tons, and consumed enough electricity to power a small neighborhood. It needed its own dedicated air conditioning system to keep the vacuum tubes from overheating, and it required a team of trained technicians to operate, monitor, and maintain it around the clock. The main SIGSALY terminal in the United States was installed in the basement of the Pentagon. Another was built in a secure facility beneath London, close enough to Downing Street that Churchill could be driven there quickly when a call was scheduled. Additional terminals were eventually installed in North Africa, Paris, and other strategic locations as the Allies advanced. Each terminal had a small, soundproof booth where the speaker sat, essentially a room within a room, heavily guarded and monitored. When Roosevelt entered the booth, he would put on a headset, wait for the technicians to confirm the system was synchronized, and then speak into a microphone connected to the massive encryption apparatus humming in the racks outside. The noise records, vinyl discs about the size of a dinner plate, were the heart of the system's security. Each pair of records could only be used once for a maximum of 12 minutes. After that, both records had to be destroyed to prevent any possibility of reuse or capture. Fresh records were manufactured in the United States, then duplicated and shipped under heavy guard to the London terminal. Losing a record, or having one fall into enemy hands, would have been catastrophic. One technician who worked on SIGSALY recalled, "You had to baby those records. If one got scratched, or if the turntables weren't perfectly synchronized, the whole call would collapse into noise. We'd spend hours before every scheduled conversation making sure everything was aligned. The pressure was immense, because we knew that if we screwed up, Roosevelt and Churchill couldn't talk, and if they couldn't talk, operations could be delayed, decisions postponed, lives lost." The first secure call, the first operational SIGSALY call between Roosevelt and Churchill, took place on July 15, 1943. By that time, the Allies were preparing for the invasion of Sicily, and secure coordination between Washington and London was critical. Imagine the scene. Roosevelt is wheeled into the Pentagon basement, escorted by Secret Service and senior military aides. He's shown into the soundproof booth, a cramped, windowless space barely large enough for his wheelchair and a small desk. Outside, a team of engineers monitors banks of glowing vacuum tubes, checking signal levels, synchronization, and line quality. In London, Churchill enters a similar room. He's been briefed on how the system works, but he's also impatient. He doesn't care about the technology, he just wants to talk. He puts on the headset and waits. The technicians on both sides give the signal, synchronized, clear to proceed. Roosevelt speaks first. His voice sounds slightly strange, mechanical, flattened by the sampling process, but it's intelligible. Churchill responds. For the first time in the war, the two most powerful leaders of the Allied cause are speaking in real time across an ocean with absolute confidence that no one else can hear them. The conversation lasts 8 minutes. They discuss troop movements, strategic priorities, and the upcoming invasion. It's brief, professional, and utterly routine, but it's also historic because it proves the system works. When the call ends, the noise records are removed from the turntables and destroyed. The transcript is classified top secret, and the technicians breathe a collective sigh of relief. One engineer later said, "We tested it 100 times, but until that first live call, we didn't know for sure it would hold up." When Roosevelt's voice came through clear, and Churchill responded without a hitch, we knew we'd done something no one else in the world could do. The logistical nightmare operating SIGSALY wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a logistical nightmare. Every terminal required a dedicated team of operators and engineers working in shifts 24 hours a day, a secure, climate-controlled facility with backup power supplies, a constant supply of fresh noise records shipped under armed guard, access to high-quality transatlantic cable or radio circuits reserved exclusively for SIGSALY use, rigorous maintenance schedules because vacuum tubes burned out constantly and any failure could kill a call mid-sentence. Synchronization was the most delicate part. The two phonograph turntables, one in Washington, one in London, had to spin at exactly the same speed, starting at exactly the same moment, and stay locked together for the entire duration of the call. Even a tiny drift in speed would cause the noise on one end to fall out of sync with the noise on the other, and the voices would dissolve into static. To solve this, the engineers used a synchronization tone, a reference signal transmitted continuously alongside the encrypted voice. Both turntables had servo motors that constantly adjusted their speed to match the tone, keeping them locked within milliseconds of each other. It was an engineering marvel, but it was also fragile. A power fluctuation, a worn belt, or a dirty stylus could throw everything off. One story, passed down among the technicians, tells of a call that nearly failed when a mouse chewed through a cable in the London terminal just minutes before a scheduled Roosevelt-Churchill conversation. Engineers scrambled to splice the cable, tested the circuit, and got the system back online with less than a minute to spare. The call went through. Roosevelt and Churchill never knew how close they had come to dead air. Secrecy. The invisible shield. One of the most remarkable aspects of SIGSALY was how few people knew it existed. The system was classified at the highest level. Even many senior government and military officials were unaware of its existence. Those who used it, Roosevelt, Churchill, Eisenhower, and a handful of other top commanders, were told only what they needed to know, that the line was secure and they could speak freely. The technicians and engineers who built and operated SIGSALY were sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial or worse. They couldn't tell their families where they worked or what they did. After the war, many of them went back to civilian life and said nothing for decades. SIGSALY remained classified until 1976, more than 30 years after the war ended. The Germans knew something was happening. They intercepted SIGSALY transmissions and heard the noise, but they couldn't break it. German cryptanalysts tried everything: frequency analysis, statistical methods, even capturing Allied communications equipment. But without the noise records, the encryption was unbreakable. One German intelligence report discovered after the war described the Allied secure voice system as impossible to decrypt with available methods. The secrecy extended even to the physical facilities. The Pentagon terminal was hidden behind multiple layers of security. Guards checked IDs. Doors were locked and monitored. And the rooms themselves were designed to prevent eavesdropping, soundproofed, shielded against electromagnetic leakage, and swept regularly for listening devices. One guard who worked outside the SIGSALY facility later recalled, "I stood at that door for 2 years. I saw Roosevelt go in. I saw generals and admirals, but I never knew what was inside. I was told, if anyone tries to enter without authorization, shoot them. That was it. No explanations." The human side, operators and engineers. Behind the technology were people, young men and women, many barely out of their teens, who operated the machines, maintained the equipment, and carried the weight of knowing that a single mistake could compromise the most important conversations of the war. One operator, a 22-year-old woman named Dorothy, worked in the Pentagon's SIGSALY terminal. Her job was to monitor signal levels and adjust filters during calls. She later described the pressure. You're sitting there with headphones on, watching needles on meters, and you know that on the other end is the President of the United States. If you mess up, if you don't catch a drift in synchronization, or if you let a signal clip, the call fails, and you don't get a second chance. Another engineer, a Bell Labs technician named Harold, spent 2 years stationed in London maintaining the British terminal. He said, "We lived with those machines. We knew every relay, every tube, every wire. At night, I'd dream about synchronization tones. It sounds obsessive, but it had to be, because the system didn't forgive mistakes." These people were heroes in their own quiet way. They didn't fight on battlefields. They didn't fly bombers or storm beaches. But they held the line, literally, between Allied leaders and the fog of war. And they did it in rooms no one would ever see, operating machines no one would ever hear about. The legacy, from SIGSALY to the digital age. When the war ended in 1945, SIGSALY was quietly decommissioned. The machines were dismantled, the records were destroyed, and the engineers went home, carrying secrets they couldn't share and knowledge they couldn't fully use yet. But the ideas behind SIGSALY didn't die. The techniques it pioneered, digital sampling, synchronized encryption, secure key distribution, became the foundation for post-war communications technology. Engineers who had worked on SIGSALY went on to build the first digital telephone switches, the first secure military communication networks, and eventually the encrypted systems we use today. The famous Red Phone hotline between Washington and Moscow during the Cold War. It was inspired directly by SIGSALY's principles, modern encrypted phones used by governments, militaries, and businesses around the world. They're descendants of the same concepts, breaking speech into pieces, adding noise or mathematical transformations, and rebuilding it on the other end. One telecommunications historian said, SIGSALY was the bridge between the analog age and the digital age. It wasn't fully digital by modern standards, but it was close enough. It proved that voices could be turned into data, encrypted, transmitted, and reconstructed securely. Everything that came after built on that proof. Today, when you make an encrypted phone call, when you use a secure messaging app, when you assume your conversation is private, you're using technology that traces its lineage back to a room in the Pentagon, a phonograph record, and two leaders who needed to talk without the world listening. The unseen shield over history. There's something profound about SIGSALY that goes beyond technology. It's a reminder that some of the most important moments in history happen in silence, or what sounds like silence to everyone except the people who need to hear. Think about the decisions made on those calls, the invasion of Normandy, the strategy for the Pacific, the allocation of resources, the timing of offensives, the coordination of millions of troops across continents. How many of those decisions were shaped by conversations that only happened because SIGSALY existed? We'll never know the full answer because many of the transcripts are still classified or were destroyed. But we know this. Roosevelt and Churchill spoke on SIGSALY dozens of times. Eisenhower used it to coordinate with Allied command. Other military leaders used it to discuss operations that, if leaked, could have cost thousands of lives. SIGSALY was an invisible shield, not over bombs or bullets, but over words. And in a war where information was as valuable as ammunition, that shield mattered as much as any tank or bomber. One historian put it this way: we remember the generals and the battles. We remember D-Day and the fall of Berlin, but we forget the infrastructure, the cables, the codes, the machines that made those victories possible. SIGSALY was part of that infrastructure. It didn't win the war by itself, but without it, the war would have been harder, longer, and bloodier. Closing questions and call to action. Many of you have told me in the comments that the stories of hidden technology and secret operations are the ones that fascinate you most, because they show how wars are won not just with courage, but with ingenuity, secrecy, and the quiet work of people whose names we'll never know. SIGSALY is one of those stories. It's a reminder that the most powerful weapon isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the one no one hears at all. But I want to ask you, first, if you'd been an engineer on the SIGSALY project, knowing your work was classified and you could never take credit for it, would you have felt frustrated, or would the mission have been enough? Second, how much of the Allied victory do you think depended on secure communications like SIGSALY? Could the war have been won without it, or would the cost have been catastrophic? And third, knowing that encrypted communication today, your phone, your apps, your privacy, descends from technology built in wartime secrecy, does that change how you think about the relationship between security and freedom? Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if this story opened your eyes to a piece of history you'd never heard before, share this video. Subscribe. Because the stories buried in basements and locked behind classification stamps are often the ones that shape the world we live in today. SIGSALY proved that secrecy, when used to protect the right things, isn't a weapon against the people, it's a shield for them. And the engineers who built that shield, who never got parades or